The scream that echoed across the Irish battlefield at Clontarf in 1014 was unlike any other heard that day. It was not the cry of a warrior falling to sword or axe, but something far more sinister, the prolonged agonizing wail of a man whose very entrails were being slowly unwound from his living body, wrapped around the trunk of an ancient oak tree like some macabre thread on a deadly spindle. This was the fatal walk, and the man experiencing this unimaginable torment was Brodir, a Viking mercenary, whose name would become forever etched in the blood-soaked pages of medieval Icelandic literature. But to understand how this savage execution came to be, we must first journey back to the world of the Vikings, where death was an art form and cruelty knew no bounds. The year was 1014, and Ireland was ablaze with conflict. The High King Brian Boru had united much of the island under his rule, but his power was challenged by a coalition of Dublin Vikings, Leinster Irish, and foreign mercenaries. Among these mercenaries was Brodir, a man whose very presence seemed to carry the stench of doom. According to the Njáls saga, one of the most detailed and haunting accounts of medieval Scandinavian literature, Brodir was no ordinary warrior. He was described as a figure of almost supernatural malevolence, a man who had abandoned his Christian faith to embrace the dark arts of sorcery and violence. The saga tells us that Brodir had once been a Christian, but his soul had been corrupted by ambition and bloodlust. He had gathered around him a band of equally ruthless men, and together they had sailed from the Isle of Man to join the forces opposing Brian Boru. But Brodir's motivations went beyond mere mercenary gold. The saga suggests that he harbored a personal vendetta against the Irish king, driven by prophecies and omens that spoke of great glory awaiting the man who could strike down the most powerful ruler in Ireland. As the Battle of Clontarf raged on that fateful Good Friday, the clash of steel on steel filled the air with a symphony of death. Warriors fell like wheat before the scythe, their blood soaking into the Irish earth. But amidst this chaos, Brodir had his eyes fixed on a single prize, King Brian Boru himself. The old king, too frail to fight in the front lines, had positioned himself in his tent, protected by a small guard of his most trusted warriors. The saga describes how Brodir, his long black hair flowing like a dark banner behind him, fought his way through the Irish lines with supernatural ferocity. His sword, according to the account, seemed to cut through armor and flesh, as if they were mere cloth. Men fell before him not just from his blade, but from the very terror his presence inspired. He was like a walking nightmare, a figure stepped out of the darkest Norse myths. When Brodir finally reached Brian Boru's tent, he found the king kneeling in prayer. The old monarch, sensing his doom, did not flee or beg for mercy. Instead, he continued his prayers, accepting his fate with the dignity befitting a king. Brodir's sword fell with a terrible finality, and Brian Boru, the last great High King of Ireland, breathed his last. But victory, as Brodir would soon discover, could be more terrible than defeat. The Irish forces, upon learning of their king's death, were not broken, but rather filled with a rage that bordered on madness. They turned on the Viking mercenaries with a fury that seemed to come from the very depths of hell itself. Brodir, who had thought himself the architect of a great triumph, suddenly found himself trapped and surrounded by enemies whose thirst for vengeance knew no bounds. The man who captured Brodir was Ulf Hreida, whose name itself speaks to the violent nature of the times. Ulf, meaning wolf, and Hreida, meaning terror or fear, was a warrior whose reputation for brutality was legendary even among the notoriously violent Vikings. When he laid hands on Brodir, he knew that a simple death would not suffice for the man who had slain their beloved king. Something more elaborate, more symbolic, more utterly horrifying was required. It was then that Ulfreda conceived of the fatal walk, a method of execution so cruel and prolonged that it would serve as both punishment and warning to any who might dare to challenge Irish sovereignty in the future. The saga describes the process with a clinical detachment that somehow makes it even more chilling. Ulf took his knife and made a careful incision in Brodir's abdomen, just deep enough to penetrate the muscle wall, but not so deep as to cause immediate death from blood loss. The human abdomen, as any warrior of the time would have known from battlefield experience, contains approximately 25 feet of small intestine coiled and folded within the abdominal cavity like a complex knot. Ulf's plan was to extract this entire length of intestine while keeping Brodir alive and conscious throughout the ordeal. The oak tree that stood nearby would serve as the spindle around which this human thread would be wound. With practiced hands, Ulf reached into the wound and grasped a loop of intestine. The saga tells us that Brodir's screams at this moment were so terrible that they could be heard above the din of the continuing battle. But Ulf was not moved by mercy. He had seen too many of his own people fall to Viking raids, too many villages burned, too many children orphaned. This was justice Viking style, where the punishment must fit not just the crime, but the terror it had inspired. The first step around the tree was the most crucial. Ulf had to maintain just the right tension on the intestine. Too loose, and it would not unwind properly. Too tight, and it would tear, ending the torture prematurely. The saga describes how Brodir, despite his agony, was forced to take that first step, his hands clutching at his opened abdomen, as if he could somehow hold his life inside his body through sheer will. But the human body, even one as strong and battle-hardened as Brodir's, was not designed to withstand such trauma. With each step around the tree, more of his intestinal tract was pulled from his body cavity. The saga notes that Brodir's face grew pale as snow, then gray as ash, but still, he walked driven by some combination of Ulf's threats and his own desperate instinct for survival. The crowd that gathered to witness this spectacle was a mixture of Irish warriors, Viking prisoners, and local civilians who had come to see the fate of the man who had killed their king. Their faces showed a complex mixture of satisfaction, horror, and fascination. This was not merely an execution. It was a ritual, a ceremony that would be remembered and retold for generations to come. As Brodir completed his second circuit of the tree, the saga tells us that he began to speak not in his native Norse tongue, but in the Irish language he had learned during his time as a mercenary. His words were a mixture of curses and prayers, calling upon both the Christian God he had abandoned and the pagan deities of his ancestors, but neither heaven nor Valhalla seemed inclined to grant him a swift death. The third step around the tree marked a turning point in the ordeal. By now, a significant portion of Brodir's small intestine had been unwound and wrapped around the oak's trunk, like some grotesque decoration. The saga describes how the intestine, pink and glistening in the afternoon sun, created an almost hypnotic pattern against the dark bark of the tree. Some witnesses later claimed that the sight reminded them of the world tree Yggdrasil from Norse mythology, with its roots and branches connecting all the 9 worlds, though in this case, it was connecting only the world of the living with the realm of the dead. Ulfreda, meanwhile, maintained his position as both executioner and guide, ensuring that Brodir continued his macabre journey around the tree. The saga suggests that Ulf took a perverse satisfaction in the proceedings, seeing it as a form of poetic justice. After all, had not the Vikings themselves pioneered numerous forms of elaborate torture and execution? The blood eagle, where the victim's ribs were broken and lungs pulled out to form wing-like shapes, was a particularly favored method among Norse warriors. the fatal walk was simply the Irish answer to Viking brutality. By the Fourth Circuit, Brodir's steps had become increasingly unsteady. The loss of blood, combined with the shock of having his internal organs exposed to the air, was beginning to take its toll. Yet the saga insists that he continued to walk driven by a combination of Ulf's commands and his own stubborn refusal to die. Perhaps in his delirium, he still believed that he might somehow survive this ordeal, that his gods might yet intervene to save him. The witnesses to this execution would later describe it as one of the most horrifying sights they had ever seen, and these were men who had lived through decades of Viking raids and Irish tribal warfare. The sight of a human being slowly unwinding like a ball of yarn, leaving a trail of his own entrails behind him, was something that challenged the very limits of human comprehension. Some of the younger warriors reportedly vomited at the sight, while others found themselves unable to look away, transfixed by the sheer impossibility of what they were witnessing. As the Fifth Circuit began, something extraordinary happened that would forever cement the fatal walk in the annals of medieval horror. Brodir, who had been growing progressively weaker with each step, suddenly seemed to find a second wind. The saga describes this moment with an almost supernatural quality, suggesting that perhaps the gods themselves were prolonging his suffering for reasons known only to them. His eyes, which had been growing dim with approaching death, suddenly blazed with a fierce intensity that startled even Ulf Rada. It was at this moment that Brodir began to speak prophecies. The saga records his words with careful precision, as if the scribes who later transcribed the account understood that they were witnessing something beyond mere execution. They were recording the final utterances of a man caught between life and death, between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits. His prophecies spoke of great changes coming to Ireland, of foreign invasions that would dwarf even the Viking raids, of kings yet unborn who would reshape the very landscape of the island. The crowd that had gathered to witness the execution found themselves caught between fascination and terror. Here was a man whose entrails were literally wrapped around a tree, yet he spoke with the clarity and authority of a seer. Some of the Irish warriors began to make the sign of the cross, while others muttered protective charms in the old Gaelic tongue. Even Ulf Hreda seemed momentarily unsettled by this turn of events, though he continued to guide his victim around the tree with grim determination. The Sixth Circuit marked another significant milestone in this macabre journey. By now, nearly half of Brodir's small intestine had been unwound from his body cavity. The saga describes how the pink coils glistened in the late afternoon sun, creating patterns around the oak tree that seemed almost decorative in their regularity. Some witnesses later claimed that the sight reminded them of the illuminated manuscripts they had seen in Irish monasteries, with their intricate spirals and interwoven designs, though this comparison was made with a mixture of awe and revulsion. It was during the circuit that Brodir began to sing. The saga tells us that his voice, though weakened by pain and blood loss, carried clearly across the battlefield. The song he chose was not a Viking war chant or a Christian hymn, but rather an ancient Irish lament that he had learned during his time as a mercenary in the service of various Irish kings. The irony was not lost on the assembled crowd. Here was the killer of their beloved Brian Boru, singing one of their own traditional songs as his life slowly unwound around an Irish oak. The melody was haunting and melancholy, speaking of heroes fallen in battle, and the eternal cycle of life and death that governed all mortal existence. As Brodir's voice rose and fell with the ancient rhythms, some of the Irish warriors found themselves humming along, caught up in the strange magic of the moment. It was as if the execution had transformed into something else entirely, a ritual that transcended the simple desire for revenge and became a meditation on the nature of mortality itself. Ulfreda, however, remained focused on his grim task. The saga describes him as a man possessed by a single-minded determination to see the execution through to its conclusion. He had promised that Brodir would not die until every last inch of his intestines had been pulled from his body, and he intended to keep that promise regardless of any supernatural manifestations or prophetic utterances. For Ulf, this was not just about revenge. It was about establishing a precedent that would echo through the ages, a warning to any future invaders who might consider challenging Irish sovereignty. The Seventh Circuit brought new challenges. Brodir's steps were becoming increasingly erratic, and several times he stumbled, nearly falling to his knees. Each time this happened, Ulf would steady him with a firm hand, ensuring that the terrible procession continued. The saga notes that by this point, Brodir's face had taken on an otherworldly pallor, as if he were already more ghost than man. Yet his eyes remained alert, darting constantly between the faces in the crowd, as if searching for something, perhaps mercy, perhaps understanding, perhaps simply acknowledgement of his suffering. It was during the circuit that one of the most disturbing aspects of the fatal walk became apparent. The saga describes how Brodir's exposed intestines began to attract flies and other insects drawn by the scent of blood and exposed flesh. The sight of these creatures crawling over the pink coils wrapped around the tree added an additional layer of horror to an already nightmarish scene. Some witnesses later reported that the buzzing of the flies created an almost musical accompaniment to Brodir's labored breathing and occasional moans of pain. The Eighth Circuit marked what many observers believed would be the end of the ordeal. Brodir's steps had become so unsteady that he was essentially being dragged around the tree by Ulfreda. His breathing had become shallow and irregular, and his skin had taken on the gray pallor that experienced warriors recognized as the approach of death. Yet somehow, impossibly, he continued to move, continued to take one step after another in his endless journey around the yoke. It was at this point that the saga introduces one of its most chilling details. As more and more of Brodir's intestinal tract was exposed to the air, the temperature difference between his internal body heat and the cool Irish afternoon began to create visible steam rising from the coils wrapped around the tree. This ghostly vapor, drifting upward through the branches of the oak, created an almost ethereal effect that some witnesses interpreted as Brodir's soul beginning to separate from his physical body. The Ninth Circuit brought a moment of unexpected drama. As Brodir rounded the far side of the tree, hidden momentarily from the view of most spectators, he suddenly lunged toward Ulfreda with his remaining strength. For a brief instant, it seemed as though he might somehow turn the tables on his executioner, perhaps grabbing Ulf's knife and ending his own suffering with a quick thrust to the heart. But his weakened condition made any effective resistance impossible, and Ulf easily subdued him, forcing him to continue his agonizing journey. This attempted escape, brief though it was, seemed to drain the last reserves of Brodir's strength. The saga describes how his movements became increasingly mechanical after this point, as if his body were continuing to function through pure momentum rather than any conscious will to survive. His eyes, which had remained alert throughout most of the ordeal, began to glaze over with the unmistakable look of approaching death. The 10th Circuit was marked by an eerie silence. Brodir had stopped singing, stopped speaking. Prophecies stopped making any sound at all, except for the wet, labored breathing that indicated his body's desperate struggle to maintain life. The crowd, too, had fallen silent, as if they sensed that they were witnessing the final moments of this extraordinary ordeal. Even the sounds of the continuing battle seemed muted and distant, as if the entire world had paused to observe the singular moment of human suffering. It was during this circuit that the saga records one of its most haunting images. As Brodir passed beneath a particular branch of the oak tree, a raven landed on the branch directly above him. The bird, black as midnight against the gray Irish sky, seemed to study the dying man with an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural. In Norse mythology, ravens were the messengers of Odin, the god of war and death, and their presence at a battlefield was considered highly significant. Some of the Viking prisoners who witnessed this scene later claimed that the raven spoke a single word in the Old Norse tongue, though they disagreed about what that word might have been. The 11th Circuit brought the first signs that the end was truly near. Brodir's legs began to buckle with increasing frequency, and Ulfreda found himself essentially carrying his victim around the tree. The saga describes how Brodir's head lolled forward onto his chest, his long black hair hanging like a curtain to hide his face from the assembled crowd. Yet still his heart continued to beat. Still his lungs continued to draw breath, as if his body refused to accept the reality of its situation. By the 12th Circuit, nearly 3/4 of Brodir's small intestine had been unwound from his body cavity. The oak tree had taken on the appearance of some grotesque maypole, decorated with pink and red streamers that glistened wetly in the fading afternoon light. The saga notes that several of the younger spectators had fainted at the sight, while others had wandered away, unable to continue watching the prolonged agony of another human being. It was during this circuit that Brodir spoke his final words. The saga records them with careful precision, though their meaning has been debated by scholars for centuries. Speaking in a mixture of Norse Irish and Latin, he seemed to be addressing not the crowd around him, but some unseen presence that only he could perceive. His words spoke of journeys to distant lands, of battles yet to be fought, of a great tree that connected all the worlds of existence. Some interpreters have suggested that in his delirium, Brodir believed he was actually walking around Yggdrasil, the world tree of Norse mythology, rather than a simple Irish oak. The 13th Circuit was marked by a phenomenon that the saga describes with almost clinical detachment. As the last portions of Brodir's small intestine were pulled from his body cavity, his large intestine began to follow. This created a visible change in the color and texture of the material being wrapped around the tree, shifting from the pink of the small intestine to the darker, thicker coils of the large intestine. The sight was so disturbing that even Ulfreda seemed momentarily taken aback, though he quickly recovered his composure and continued with his grim task. It was at this point that the saga introduces what may be its most supernatural element. As Brodir completed his 13th circuit of the tree, witnesses reported seeing a strange light emanating from the coils of intestine wrapped around the oak. This light, described as pale blue and flickering like foxfire, seemed to pulse in rhythm with Brodir's failing heartbeat. Some observers claimed it was merely a trick of the late afternoon sun filtering through the tree's branches, while others insisted it was evidence of otherworldly forces at work. The 14th Circuit brought the climax of this horrific ordeal. By now, virtually all of Brodir's intestinal tract had been unwound from his body cavity, creating a complete spiral around the oak tree, from its base nearly to the height of a man's head. The saga describes how Brodir's steps had become so weak and faltering that he was essentially being dragged by Ulfreda, his feet barely touching the ground, as he completed his final journey around the tree. As the last few inches of intestine were pulled from his body, Brodir suddenly straightened up with a final surge of strength that startled everyone present. His eyes, which had been dim and unfocused for several circuits, suddenly blazed with their original intensity. He looked directly at Ulf Hrada and spoke a single word in perfect Irish, Criochnaithe, finished. Then with a sound that witnesses described as something between a sigh and a death rattle, Broder of Man collapsed to the ground at the base of the oak tree, his extraordinary ordeal finally at an end. The silence that followed was profound and unsettling. The saga tells us that for several long moments, no one moved or spoke. The crowd stood transfixed, staring at the bizarre tableau before them. The oak tree wrapped in human entrails, like some nightmare Christmas decoration, and at its base, the still form of the man who had killed their king. Even the sounds of the continuing battle seemed muted and distant, as if the entire world had paused to acknowledge the passing of this remarkable and terrible moment. Ulf Hrada stood motionless beside the oak tree for what seemed like an eternity, his bloodied hands still gripping the final coil of intestine that had been pulled from Broder's body. The saga describes this moment with remarkable detail, noting how the Irish warrior's face showed not triumph or satisfaction, but rather a kind of hollow emptiness, as if the completion of his terrible task had drained something essential from his own soul. The crowd, too, remained frozen in place, as if they were all participants in some ancient ritual that had not yet reached its proper conclusion. It was then that the true horror of what they had witnessed began to sink in. The saga tells us that several of the spectators began to weep, not from sadness for Brodir, who had after all murdered their beloved king, but from a deeper, more primal emotion that seemed to spring from the very core of human nature. They had watched a man die in a way that challenged every assumption about the limits of human endurance and the boundaries between life and death. The fatal walk had become something more than an execution. It had become a glimpse into the darkest corners of human possibility. The oak tree itself seemed transformed by what had occurred beneath its branches. The saga describes how the coils of intestine wrapped around its trunk had begun to change color in the cooling evening air, shifting from pink to deep red to an almost purple hue that reminded witnesses of the royal colors worn by kings. Some of the more superstitious observers began to whisper that the tree had been cursed, that it would never again bear healthy leaves or provide shelter for travelers. Others claimed that it had been blessed, that it would become a site of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the mysteries of life and death. As the immediate shock of Brodir's death began to fade, practical considerations reasserted themselves. The battle at Clontarf was still raging, though news of Brian Boru's death had begun to spread through both armies, fundamentally altering the nature of the conflict. The Irish forces, initially devastated by the loss of their king, had rallied with a fury that surprised even their enemies. The Viking coalition, meanwhile, found themselves fighting not just for victory, but for survival, as the Irish warriors seemed determined to exact revenge for every slight, every raid, every burned village that had marked centuries of Norse aggression. Ulf Hrada, his grim task completed, turned his attention back to the battle, but the saga suggests that he was never quite the same after that day. The act of executing Brodir in such an elaborate and prolonged manner had marked him in ways that went beyond the physical. Other warriors began to avoid him, sensing something changed in his demeanor. He had looked too deeply into the abyss of human suffering, and the abyss had looked back into him. The immediate aftermath of the fatal walk created ripple effects that extended far beyond the battlefield at Clontarf. Word of Brodir's extraordinary death spread quickly through the Viking world, carried by survivors of the battle who returned to their homes in the Orkneys, the Hebrides, and the Isle of Man. The story grew in the telling, as such stories always do, acquiring new details and supernatural elements with each retelling. Some versions claim that Brodir had walked around the tree not 14 times but 40, a number heavy with biblical significance. Others insisted that his intestines had formed mystical patterns around the oak, spelling out prophecies in ancient runic script. The saga itself, written down decades after the events it describes, represents an attempt to preserve the true version of the story for posterity. But even the saga writers seemed uncertain about some details, occasionally offering alternative versions of events, or noting that different witnesses had provided conflicting accounts. This uncertainty only added to the story's power, allowing each listener or reader to fill in the gaps with their own imagination, making the tale even more vivid and disturbing. The psychological impact of the fatal walk extended beyond those who witnessed it directly. The very idea that such a death was possible seemed to challenge fundamental assumptions about human mortality. In an age when violent death was commonplace, when warriors routinely witnessed the aftermath of battles and the results of various forms of execution, the fatal walk stood out as something uniquely horrifying. It was not just the physical suffering involved, though that was certainly extreme, but the prolonged nature of the ordeal that made it so disturbing. Medieval medical knowledge limited, though it was included, a basic understanding of human anatomy gained from battlefield experience and the butchering of animals. Warriors and physicians alike knew that the human intestinal tract was extensive, but few had ever seen it fully displayed in such a manner. The fatal walk provided a grotesque anatomy lesson that challenged viewers' understanding of their own bodies and mortality. The sight of Brodir's entrails wrapped around the oak tree served as a visceral reminder of the fragility of human life and the thin membrane that separates the living from the dead. The religious implications of the fatal walk were equally profound. In an era when Christianity was still competing with older pagan beliefs throughout much of Northern Europe, Brodir's death seemed to embody elements of both traditions. The prolonged suffering recalled the Christian emphasis on martyrdom and redemption through pain, while the ritualistic nature of the execution echoed older sacrificial practices associated with sacred trees and groves. The oak tree itself held special significance in both Celtic and Germanic traditions, often serving as a symbol of strength, endurance, and connection between the earthly and divine realms. Some Christian observers interpreted Brodir's death as divine punishment for his apostasy and his murder of the pious King Brian. They pointed to the fact that the execution took place on Good Friday, the day commemorating Christ's crucifixion, as evidence of God's hand in the proceedings. The prolonged suffering was seen as appropriate penance for the magnitude of Brodir's sins, while his final prophecies were dismissed as the ravings of a damned soul. Pagan interpreters, however, saw different meanings in the events. The oak tree, sacred to many Germanic and Celtic peoples, became a focal point for various supernatural explanations. Some claimed that Brodir's death had awakened ancient spirits that dwelt within the tree, while others suggested that the execution had created a permanent gateway between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The raven that had perched above Brodir during his final circuits was interpreted as a messenger from Odin, come to claim the soul of a warrior who had died in battle, albeit in a most unusual manner. The practical effects of the fatal walk on Viking raiding culture were significant and long-lasting. The story served as a powerful deterrent to would-be raiders, demonstrating that the Irish were capable of matching and even exceeding Viking brutality when sufficiently provoked. The elaborate nature of Brodir's execution sent a clear message those who attacked Irish kings could expect not just death, but death of such a prolonged and horrifying nature that it would serve as a warning to others for generations to come. The saga writers were careful to preserve not just the facts of the execution, but also its emotional and psychological impact on those who witnessed it. They describe how many of the spectators were haunted by nightmares for months afterward, dreams in which they found themselves walking endless circles around trees, while their own entrails unwound behind them. Some warriors reportedly became reluctant to venture into oak groves, fearing that they might encounter the ghost of Brodir, still walking his eternal circuit around the cursed tree. The story of the Fatal Walk also influenced the development of other execution methods throughout medieval Europe. While no other documented cases exist of the exact technique used on Brodir, various forms of prolonged disembowelment became more common in the centuries following the Battle of Clontarf. The idea that execution could serve not just as punishment, but as public spectacle and deterrent became increasingly accepted, leading to the elaborate public executions that would characterize the later medieval period. The literary legacy of the Fatal Walk extends far beyond the original saga account. The story was retold and adapted by numerous writers throughout the medieval period, each adding their own embellishments and interpretations. Some versions emphasize the supernatural elements, portraying Brodir as a figure of almost mythological significance, whose death marked the end of an era. Others focused on the political implications, using the story to illustrate the consequences of foreign intervention in Irish affairs. Modern scholars have debated the historical accuracy of the Fatal Walk account, with some arguing that the physical impossibility of the described execution suggests that it is largely fictional. They point out that the massive blood loss and shock that would result from opening the abdominal cavity would make it impossible for anyone to remain conscious and mobile for the extended period described in the saga. The human body, they argue, simply could not survive the trauma long enough for the full execution to be carried out as described. Other scholars, however, argue that the consistency of the account across multiple sources suggests that something resembling the Fatal Walk did indeed occur, even if the details have been exaggerated over time. They note that medieval people had a different understanding of human anatomy and physiology, and that what seems impossible to modern medical knowledge might have seemed plausible to contemporary observers. The fact that the story was recorded in multiple independent sources suggests that it was based on some actual event, however distorted by time and retelling. The psychological truth of the Fatal Walk, regardless of its literal accuracy, remains undeniable. The story captures something essential about the nature of human cruelty and the lengths to which people will go in pursuit of revenge. It serves as a reminder that the capacity for both extraordinary suffering and extraordinary brutality lies within the human experience, waiting to be awakened by the right combination of circumstances and motivation. The oak tree at Clontarf, whether it ever actually served as the instrument of Brodir's death or not, became a symbol of the complex relationship between violence and justice, between punishment and spectacle, between the desire for revenge and the need for closure. The image of a man's life literally unwinding around the trunk of a tree serves as a powerful metaphor for the fragility of human existence and the terrible creativity that humans can bring to the task of destroying one another. In the end, the Fatal Walk stands as one of the most haunting and memorable accounts in all of medieval literature, a story that continues to disturb and fascinate readers more than 1,000 years after the events it purports to describe. Whether fact or fiction, historical record or literary creation, it remains a testament to the dark corners of human imagination and the enduring power of a well-told tale of horror and revenge. The legacy of Brodir and his terrible death lived on long after the last echoes of the Battle of Clontarf had faded into history, a reminder that some stories are too powerful to die, too disturbing to forget, and too human in their darkness to dismiss as mere fantasy.